Good morning, everybody. Day 2, and we are picking up where we left off with the Twits. Can you remember what happened last time? We had 2 people, Mr. Twit, Mrs. Twit. Were they nice people? They were mean people, weren't they? Ugly, mean people. Mr. Twit had a big beard, didn't he, that had all food inside. Like, what could we remember what was in there? Fish, sardines, cornflakes, stinky cheese, and he used to wipe it on his sleeve, didn't he? Ugh, not nice. Then we had Mrs. Twit, who had a stick. What did she do with that stick? Wasn't for warts on her feet, really, was it? It was for hitting small animals and small children. So they used to play lots of tricks on each other, didn't they? And we have learned that they played tricks. What did they do? Let me just have a quick look. Oh, yes. Mrs. Twit did something to Mr. Twit. Something with her glass eye. She put it in his beard, didn't she? Ugh. And then he did something to her. Something that jumped. He put a frog in her bed, didn't he? Inside her bed. Okay. Before we get ready to read more of the chapter, I want you to find somewhere comfortable to sit. We're going to do our rhyme. 1 and 2, we know what to do. 3 and 4, we sit on the floor. 5 and 6, our legs we fix. 7 and 8, we sit up straight. 9 and 10, we're quiet again. Are you ready? Chapter 7. Oh, I don't know whether you can see that very well. Let's try it. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with spaghetti. But only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around with it with his fork. Can you see them? "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which, of course, had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork. He shoveled them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squidgy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the back of his hand. Oh, not with the back of his hand, sorry. With the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. Oh, isn't she a meanie? Chapter 8. The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny piece of round wood, no thicker than a penny, on to the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it is happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too big for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. I think it is getting a bit big, isn't it? And there he is in his work shed, sticking the bits on. Dear. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at the old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've noticed it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting on your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Dear. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit of extra wood on the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble, but Mr. Twit still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At that rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready, I'll hurry, I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Chapter 10. Mrs. Twit Gets a Stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring to the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied round her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. You see her there. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you now?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If these strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Chapter 11. Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," Mrs. Twit cried. "Put some more string round my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, with a ghoulish grin on his lips. He knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." Oh my goodness, look at her floating up there in the sky. Chapter 12. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at the extraordinary old woman in the sky. That's it for today. I'm going to read some more tomorrow. Have a lovely day. Be nice to everybody that you see. We will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.